Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right, today we're headed back to Brooklyn to cover the White Hand Gang. And for all my day one guys, you guys know that this was a story I did when I first started the channel. I think it was the third video I dropped, but it got taken down. And like all those videos I redo, this is kind of personal. I feel like I have something to prove, so this is the real story, done right. This is what really happened. The real story of the White Hand Gang. When the Brooklyn Bridge was completed in 1883, many of the Irish who lived on the Lower East Side moved to Brooklyn and settled right near the bridge. Brooklyn, although right across the river from Manhattan, was not considered New York. It was the suburbs. It still had dirt roads and farmland and a police force that was close to non-existent. Unlike Manhattan, where the money was, in Brooklyn, a criminal was able to spread his wings. He didn't have to worry about the law so much as others like himself. From the beginning, the Irish created neighborhood gangs in what was called Irishtown. The Red Onion Gang, the Frank Byrne Gang, the J Street Gang, and the White Hand Gang, just to name a few. Over the years, it would be the White Hand name that stuck. A play on the Italian mano nero, the Black Hand. And just like the Italian Black Hand, the Irish White Hand Gang will be a blanket term used for all Irish gangsters that operated on the docks. From the 1880s to 1919, the gangs were just a nuisance. They spent most of their time getting drunk, getting into fights, and getting drunk, and getting into more fights. They were willing to fight anyone. They would stand on street corners begging for money, and if a person refused the request, he or she was beaten. They loved to fight each other, but they loved to fight cops even more. Like the time when the two leaders of the J Street Gang, Arthur and Charlie Johnson, challenged the whole precinct to a fight in the 1880s. They would lose, but not before sending several officers to the hospital. For the most part, the gangs were mostly bands of ruffians, made up of youths who stood on street corners preying on the honest working people, harassing women, begging for bid money, and beating those who didn't contribute, forcing the people to support their idleness and for the right to walk the streets peacefully. In the late hours of October 13, 1910, a member of the White Hand Gang named George Stapleton, 17 years old, entered the bar of James Higgins at 172 Court Street. He made his way to the back where several men were drinking and challenged everyone to a fight, or a row, as they called it. No one took the bait, and Higgins had him kicked out. Stapleton left kicking and screaming and vowing revenge. He walked off cursing, and the drinking continued. Just after midnight, two more of the gang, Thomas O'Connell, known on the streets as Peter the Buck, and James Sweeney, entered the bar, already drunk, and challenged everyone to a row. When O'Connell got into the face of James Donahue, a 24-year-old stableman, Donahue wanted no parts. He got up and left, followed by his pal Joseph Boyle, a 27-year-old engineer. The two were standing out front of the bar when O'Donnell and Sweeney came out. They immediately attacked Donahue, and while they were putting hands and feet on him, Boyle jumped in to help, and he was given the same treatment. Almost. Boyle, who was described in the paper as being mauled, was taken to the Long Island College Hospital. Donahue was not so lucky. He died of his injuries. On September 25, 1910, members of the White Hand Gang walked into the Mohawk Garage on South Ortland Avenue wielding an axe, a knife, and a pistol, and held the place up. They stole several cans of chop suey and demanded a car, but were told that they had to wait until one returned. While they ate, they forced the employees to give them a minstrel show and then made the employees watch and clap for them while they did the turkey trot. As they were leaving, a car pulled up. They put the gun into the driver's face and made the chauffeur drive him around Brooklyn. They were arrested in front of a chop suey place in Brooklyn a few hours later. Apparently, they gained a fondness for the meal. On June 20th, 1913, the gang was without leadership. Two men declared themselves as candidates for the job. James Toohey and Thomas Mulvihill. They were both 28 and represented different factions within the gang. The election was to be held in the gang's headquarters in the old shanty by the waterfront. The election proceedings went like this. The two factions would fight it out. Whoever had the most men standing at the end would be the boss. The police were aware of the plans, but because there was a driving rainstorm, the police thought it would be called off. When they were alerted of the fight, they came running and found over 50 men raining blows on each other in the pouring rain. The cops arrested everyone they could, including the two candidates. We'll never know who won that election, but the police had a guy named Charles Ward, 24 years old, who had 22 arrests since he was 16, pinned as the boss. On August 17, 1913, Robert Englehart, a newsman, was in a bar at Warren and Bond. He and Charles Ward had been friends for years, but had a falling out a few weeks prior. When Ward came into the bar, he was already drunk and angry. Robert's brother saw him and tried to get his brother out of the place. Ward rushed them both and said, "I got you now," and then shots rang out. Ward fired one shot into Robert. He fell dead on the floor. Patrolman Moriarty, who was posted a block away, saw a man take off running and toss a pistol. He gave chase and caught Ward a few blocks away. He was arrested and later found guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. In 1914, Some of the members of the gang came up with a scheme where they would seek out furnished apartments, make arrangements to view them, and then come back and steal all the furniture. In April of 1914, several men and a woman were arrested and sent to jail. Over the next few years, the leadership of the gang changed hands several times. William Bill Russell took over until he was shot by Pickles Landon in November of 1912. Mickey Gilligan was the boss until he was shot by George McCarthy in Buster's Club on Tillery Street in 1914. Wild Bill Rooney, a prize fighter, was said to hold the reins until he was killed by an Italian bartender named Clemente in May of 1919. The Italian gangs in Brooklyn were also making money on the docks. The close proximity to the neighborhoods meant that the two would often clash. In 1917, an Irishman was stabbed to death by an Italian from the Navy Street gang. This gang was run by Frankie Yale, and a young hoodlum named Alphonse Capone was a member, and he took part in the killing. This set off a beef that would last for years. In fact, the beef with the Irish gangs was a major reason for Al Capone leaving Brooklyn and making his way to Chicago. October 1919, Samuel Angelo was sitting in a diner at 140 Sand Street with two other men. During the meal, two men walked into the front door with hard faces and bad intentions. Without words, one of the men opened fire on Angelo, who was hit in the chin, wrist, and chest. The two shooters ran out. A few moments later, they were found hiding in the doorway by a patrolman. Chris Donnelly and William J. Lovett were arrested. They were taken back to the restaurant where they were identified by Angelo. Angelo was taken to the hospital. William and his friend went to jail. Angelo would die from his injuries, and Bill and Donnelly were charged with murder. The charges would later be dropped due to lack of evidence. By 1919, Dennis Meehan was the boss, and he organized the waterfronts under one umbrella, the White Hand Gang. No one worked on the dock or pushed a hand truck without paying Denny. Denny had a headquarters in a dingy shack at 25 Bridge Street. This was when the shape-ups and the robberies on the docks really amped up. Denny was a big, tough guy who had been a pain in the ass to the cops for years. He was arrested many times for robbery, assault, and for stealing the coat of an off-duty cop at gunpoint in 1919. He began his criminal career as a burglar and an armed robber, but he rose to power as a strikebreaker when the docks unionized. If he was hired by the bosses, the job was done. Well, even though Denny was a big man on the docks, he was a born thief. He couldn't help himself. In March of 1920, a team of Denny's men pulled up to the dock, approached the truck, pulled the driver aside, and then took the truck to one of Denny's warehouses. The truck that was stolen was supposed to be unloaded by a crew of unloaders led by William Wild Bill Lovett. Denny was arrested for the theft and sat in the jail for a few weeks until he made bail. On March 29, 1920, Denny was sleeping off his latest night of drinking in his bedroom with his wife. At 3 p.m., 4 men pulled up outside of 432 Warren Street, got out and climbed the stairs to his apartment. The 3 men entered the apartment to find Denny's mother-in-law sleeping in a chair in the kitchen and his young son playing in the living room. When the men started back to the bedroom, the little boy said, "No, my mother and father are sleeping there. You'll wake them up." He tried to block them but was pushed aside. 2 men entered the bedroom, took aim at the sleeping gangster, and shots rang out. The sleeping Meehan was hit in the neck, head, and chest. 1 bullet passed through him and lodged into his wife's chest. She woke up to find her husband bleeding and called the police. She did not realize that she had been shot until they arrived and examined her. She would make it, but not Denny. Blame was placed on Bill, and he was found in a drunken stupor of the home of Mary Lonergan, the mother of his lieutenant, Richard Lonergan, and arrested. William J. Lovett was born July 15, 1884, in Lixnaw, Ireland, and he and his family moved to Brooklyn when he was still young. Unlike the others in the neighborhood, the Lovetts came to America with money, were well off financially, and his father became a respected man in the community. But Bill had other plans. As a teen, he was running the streets at night with the J Street gang. At 18, he was sent away for 6 months for disorderly conduct. He would go on to be arrested more than 15 times, 7 for murder. Each time, he was released due to lack of evidence or witnesses willing to testify. Eventually, Bill made his way to the docks. But Bill was a slight man, growing to 5'7" and barely 100 pounds, and the hard work did not agree with him. So he used his smarts to get less strenuous work. And soon, things started to disappear from the docks, and Bill began to make more money than a dock laborer should be making. Bill was a rising star on the docks, but he put his career on hold when he enlisted in the Army on April 19, 1917, and headed over to France to fight in World War I. Bill did not go to France to push a pen or be a cook. He wanted action, so he joined the Suicide Squad as a machine gunner. His unit was placed on the front where Bill got all the action he wanted. In France, when he shot a guy, he didn't get arrested. In fact, he got honored. He received a Distinguished Service Cross when he went into no man's land to save a fellow soldier. During the fighting, Bill was gassed. He was sent home in 1919 and stayed in the Army hospital while he recovered. After 6 months, on July 20th, 1919, Bill left the hospital despite the doctor's advice. He weighed 100 pounds on the hospital scale. When Bill got back to Brooklyn, he took part in the Angelo shooting. After the charges were dropped, he went back to the docks. Dennis Meehan was well entrenched, but Bill was determined to become a force. Bill began to speak with the men who worked on the docks, many he grew up with, and got the support of about 15 of them. A few weeks later, Bill went to see Denny at 25 Bridge Street. The two knew each other and were friendly. Denny said, "What do you want?" Bill said he wanted his own team of loaders. He had them already picked out and he would drive them. Denny towered over Bill and he was not afraid of him, but he should have been. Denny told him he would think about it, and Bill left. The next morning, without confirmation, Bill showed up with 15 of Denny's best guys and took the easiest, most lucrative work. Denny's men didn't know what to do. After a few weeks, Denny was not happy about the arrangement. He came to Bill and demanded a kickback. Bill said okay, but he didn't give him a dime. Denny sent his men to steal a truckload of shoes. Then the three men walked into Denny's apartment. The morning after Dennis Meehan's death, Bill walked into 25 Bridge Street. The stevedores were all discussing Denny's demise. No one knew what to make of it, until Bill strolled over and sat in Denny's seat and announced that he would be the boss now. Under Bill, the gang expanded into bootlegging. They controlled the docks and sold it to bootleggers looking to bring in booze. They also dealt in home brew and were often drunk off their own supply. In early April, Bill and some of his gang were at a house party at 124 Bridge Street, the home of Francis Manley, when a man named Tim Montague made the mistake of saying something disrespectful to Manley's wife, and someone put 3 slugs in him. Bill and 4 of his guys were arrested. Not everyone was happy about the new leadership. Denny had a lot of friends, and Bill was not making any new ones. Under Bill, the price of working on the dock increased. Before, if a guy made $6, he had to pay Denny 1. Bill demanded 2. On May 7, 1920, Bill and the men arrested with him for the Montague shooting were leaving the Adams Street courthouse after a bail hearing. They were walking down Adams Street, and when they got near Nassau Avenue, from out of nowhere, shots rang out. Everyone hit the ground and was okay except for Bill, who had been shot in the arm and the chest. His boys got him into a passing motorist car, and they dropped him off at the front door of the hospital and drove off. Bill walked himself in. His wounds were superficial, and he was back on the streets in no time. In December of 1922, Bill was arrested and charged with the murder of Daniel Gilleen, a black man in a saloon on Front and J Street after an argument. He disappeared, or at least the cops didn't look for him for 2 years when the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. On May 14, 1922, Joseph Behan, a White Hand member, got home around midnight. He climbed into his bed half dressed, put his .22 caliber revolver on the floor next to him, and fell asleep next to his wife. Sometime in the night, he was rudely awakened when a slug slammed into his chest right under his heart. The shot woke his wife, and she said that the door was open and she heard someone running down the hall. Police were called, and he was taken to the hospital where he would survive, but he was charged with the pistol. No one was ever charged for the shooting. On January 3, 1923, one of Bill's friends climbed the stairs of a shanty at 289 Front Street, the warehouse for the gang's homemade booze. When he got to the top floor, he found Bill lying on a dirty bed with 3 bullets in his chest. When the police arrived, they asked Bill who did it, and he said, "Get me to the hospital, get me fixed up, and when I get better, I'll deal with this myself." He was taken to the hospital where it looked like he wouldn't make it, but he recovered and stayed there for a few more months. While Bill was in the hospital, he got engaged to Anna Lonergan, the sister of his lieutenant, Richard Pegleg Lonergan. During his recovery in the hospital, he received gifts and flowers from lots of female fans. Anna did not like this and told the press that Bill was taken and these ladies should not waste their time because they were soon to be married. In March of 1923, Bill's lieutenant, Richard Pegleg Lonergan, was in a homebrew club on Gold Street, along with 50 other men and women. Outside, a man pulled up in a taxi. He got out, spoke with 2 men outside the club, handed one man a pistol, and they all went inside. Richard was sitting at a table when shots rang out. A dozen shots sent the drunken patrons running, and the piano player diving for cover. Richard had one bullet pass through his arm into his gut. He fell forward on the table. When the police arrived, they found one right-hander, Joseph Lynch, in the hallway shot with an empty revolver next to him. Richard, Frank Burroughs, and William Guerin were found wounded. They would all survive and be taken to the Cumberland Street Hospital where they were reunited with Bill Lovett. But Pegleg had nerve damage and would add a withered arm to his list of ailments. Bill was finally released from the hospital in late March, and he wasted no time reasserting himself. A week later, he was arrested in front of 3 Willoughby Street. He was intoxicated and causing a scene. When the policeman arrived and told him to move along, he did not. So he was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct. Unlike many of his gang, Bill did not fight with cops. Every time he was arrested, 16, he gave up without a struggle and was polite each time. His lawyer tried to argue his client's innocence, but Bill cut him off and told the judge that he was guilty as charged. He was given a 15-day sentence and he was taken away smirking. A week after being released from that charge, Bill found himself in the back room of Thomas Sand's saloon at York and J Street. The tiny dark room was packed with the kind of people you'd expect to be in a cheap Brooklyn speakeasy in 1923. Among them was James Quilty, a member of a rival faction of the White Hand Gang run by Frank Byrne. Bill and Quilty got into a heated argument. Bill gave him a rap on the mouth and Quilty left saying he would return. True to his word, he did, this time with his brother Timothy. Now, Timothy was a working guy, not a gangster, but he was an Irishman from Brooklyn, so he had no problem fighting. After they arrived, the argument broke out again. Moments later, Thomas Sand's wife ran to the corner of York and Bridge Street and told the officer that the Lovett gang is in our saloon and they're killing my husband. The officer made his way back to the saloon where he found James Quilty huddled in the corner with a large gash on his face and cuts and stab wounds on his head, and Timothy Quilty, dead with 3 bullets in him. One, a headshot so close it left burn marks on his hat. Bill was nowhere to be found. James Quilty would survive, but his brother would not. When James was searched, the police found a gun with 5 spent cartridges. The shooters had placed it there before they left. James was arrested for the gun, but was released. Also arrested was a Lovett man, Frank Healy. Bill would be arrested along with 2 others on May 8th in a restaurant at 138 Maja Street and charged with the murder. He was released due to lack of evidence. But when the police arrested him, they found a gun underneath his chair, and he was rearrested a week later on a gun charge. The killing of Quilty set off a war in Brooklyn. While Bill sat in the Raymond Street jail, his pal, dock worker Frank Healy, was killed on May 21st at 8:55 a.m. on the corner of Plymouth and J Street. A witness saw 2 men arguing and a tall one pull a gun and shoot the other man and run off. Frank Healy lay face down in the rain, dead from a bullet in the heart. Although witnesses could not identify the shooter, Bill and his guys had a feeling. Frank Byrne was a 24-year-old tough guy and member of the Red Onion Gang. He was friends with Dennis Meehan, and James Quilty was in his gang. 5 days after Healy was bumped off, Bill was back. At 3 a.m. on May 26, Frank Byrne and James Martin were walking down Nassau Street near Gold when shots rang out. Out of nowhere, a barrage of lead flew at the 2 men. Frank Byrne fell to the ground pretending to be dead. James Martin ran off and was shot once in the gut. The shooters ran away. Frank Byrne got up and dragged Martin around the corner to the fire station where an ambulance was called. Martin would make it to the hospital but died shortly after. When the police found out about the shooting, they raided the Lovett Gang headquarters at the Brownie Club at 226 Nassau Street. They found Bill intoxicated. Him, Richard Pegleg Lonergan, and 14 others were arrested. While in the hospital with Martin, Frank Burns was arrested and charged for the shooting of Healy. July 13th, Frank Burns, fresh out the Raymond Street jail after the Healy murder case was dropped, stopped by Deegan's Bar at 186 Sand Street for a drink. Also thirsty that hot summer night was Frank Seaman, one of Bill's lieutenants. When Frank Burns got to the back room, Frank Seaman was already there. The 2 Franks exchanged dirty looks that escalated to heated words, and then they both backed away, pulled guns, and shots rang out. Standing just 10 feet apart, both gangsters emptied their revolvers until the room was filled with gun smoke and devoid of patrons. The police were summoned, but when they arrived, they found no one. Burns was later found at Nassau on Gold Street, and Seaman at Hudson Avenue and Sand Street. Both men were bleeding. Frank Burns was shot in the wrist, while Frank Seaman was shot in the hands. They were taken to separate hospitals where they both refused to talk. Frank Burns was held, but released. The next day, Bill stood trial for his gun possession charge. Anna took the stand and said that the gun found underneath Bill belonged to her deceased father, Pop Lonergan. The first trial ended in a hung jury. During the second trial, the judge ordered that the case be put on hold and Bill was released on bail. The next day, Bill and Anna tied the knot. Bill and Anna honeymooned on South Long Island. Back in Brooklyn, things were still hot. A Lovett man named George Crichton was shot through the heart when 2 of the 5 men he was walking down Johnson Street near Navy Street suddenly pulled pistols and began firing. Also hit was Margaret Mestrel. The 24-year-old was shot in the leg as she held an infant in front of a candy store. The policemen heard the shooting and came running. They fired at the fleeing gunmen, but they got away. This shooting was connected to the gang's newest venture, Colombian sniffing powder. Creighton had made several trips to South America and was the #1 man in Brooklyn to see in that regard. In August of 24, Pegleg Lonergan, his girlfriend, and a bunch of the gangs and their girls rented a bungalow on Coney Island. After several complaints of rowdy behavior, the police raided the bungalow and arrested them all. Richard got sentenced to 3 months in a workhouse, the rest of the men received 30-day sentences, and the women were released. Already a frail man, his gassing in France during the war left Bill with a bad lung. The doc said that if he didn't calm down, stop drinking, and live a quiet life, he would be dead in 6 months. So his new wife decided to prove all the people who said Bill couldn't be rehabilitated wrong. She got a little place at 60 Wyant Street in Ridgefield Park, New Jersey, and made a garden for Bill to work. Bill followed her directions. He planted flowers, took long walks with her, and ate good. Got plenty of rest and stopped drinking, and he gained 30 pounds, all due to Anna, who he called the sheriff. For months, everything was going well. Bill had dealings in the streets that kept the money flowing in, but 4 months after moving to Jersey, family brought Bill back to Brooklyn. On Halloween night, 1923, Bill was headed back to Brooklyn to visit his mother on her 60th birthday. He promised Anna that he wouldn't drink and he would be back that evening. Anna protested, but he convinced her to let him go. When Bill touched down in Brooklyn, he met up with an old pal, a white-hander named Joey Flynn. Bill was supposed to go straight to his mother's, but he figured that one drink wouldn't hurt, so they ducked into a bar. By midnight, the two had finished off a whole bottle of rye, and Bill had broken his promise to Anna. He called her and tried to explain. He asked her to come get him, but she hung up the phone in anger. Bill, already in the hot seat, decided to finish his night in Brooklyn. He and Joey decided to go to the gang's hangout, the shack at 25 Bridge Street, in the shadow of the Manhattan Bridge. At this point, Bill could hardly walk or stand. Moments after arriving at Bridge Street, Bill passed out on the bench. His pal Joey removed his own coat, rolled it up, and placed it under Bill's head and went home. An hour or so later, Bill was the only one in the joint, until 3 men walked in. The 3 men stood over the helpless gangster, not believing their luck, and took their time. One of the men reached into his coat, pulled a revolver, and shots rang out. The man pumped 3 slugs into the chest of the helpless tough guy. Bill, still unconscious, instinctively threw his hands up ready to fight, but it did him no good. Not being satisfied, one of the killers buried a meat cleaver into Bill's skull for good measure. The next morning, an officer passed the shanty and noticed the front door open. He went in to find Bill stretched out under a photo of Abraham Lincoln. When Anna's phone rang in New Jersey, she answered it with the intent of reading her husband the riot act. But her anger turned to sadness when the officer on the other end asked her to come to Brooklyn to identify Bill's body. When the police found Flynn's blood-stained coat, they arrested him and charged him with the murder. He admitted it was his coat, but he said he left it with Bill and he was home in bed when the deed took place. His wife confirmed his story and he was let go. William J. Lovett was buried with full military honors by 2 American legions, and he was remembered for his bravery in combat. The murder of Bill was never solved. Anybody who was anybody was suspected, from fellow members of his gang to men seeking revenge for the murders that happened that summer to the Italians looking to take over the docks. Some stories say that it was young Vince Mangano who was responsible, but the murder was never solved. With the demise of Bill, his brother-in-law, Richard Lonergan, took over as boss of the gang. One of 14 kids born, 6 of whom survived to John and Mary Lonergan. The couple were married when Mary was 15 and John was 18. A week after their wedding, he became abusive for the first time. John, who was a gangster from the Lower East Side, moved the family from Manhattan and settled at 113 Johnson Street in Brooklyn. Over the next few years, he would routinely get drunk, abuse Mary and the children. He constantly slept around on her, and when their son Richard was injured by a trolley and lost the lower part of his leg, John squandered the $6,000 settlement on booze and women. None of it was spent on his family. On Christmas 1923, John hit Mary after an argument, left the family, and never came home. At first, he would send $10 a week to help support the family. That dropped to $3, and eventually nothing. On May 16, 1923, Mary, in need of money, went to the bicycle shop John owned to ask for money to buy food and pay bills. She got called everything in the book, threatened, and she went home empty-handed. She sent her daughter Anna to go talk with her father. He gave her the same treatment, plus a rap in the mouth. Anna went home crying and bleeding. Mary returned again with the bloody-mouthed Anna and 13-year-old son Willie. And again, she asked for money. And again, he said he didn't have it. The two began to argue, and young Willie began to cry, which caused John to lose it. He struck Mary several times. Mary Lonergan, fearing for her safety, reached over the counter and grabbed the revolver that was in the drawer, and shots rang out. Fed up from the years of abuse, Mary Lonergan pumped 2 slugs into the chest of her husband. He fell, his face in shock as he bled to death on the floor of his bike shop. Mary would claim that the shooting was an accident and that they were fighting over the gun and it went off accidentally. Twice. She would be found not guilty. The cops, on the other hand, believed that it was her son, Richard Pegleg Lonergan, who was responsible for the murder. Richard Lonergan was born January 16, 1900. Now, I've already laid out his home life, so you can imagine how he was in the streets. At the age of 9, Richard was hit by a trolley car and was injured while crossing Adams and Sand Street. The lower part of his leg was amputated and he was given a prosthetic leg. He never let that stop him. He was often arrested for assault, robbery, disorderly conduct, and murder. Richard was the tough guy despite him having one leg, or maybe because of it. At 18, he was arrested and charged with the shooting of a police officer. The police claimed that they had a running pistol battle with Richard, but they failed to explain how a man with a false leg could run so fast, nor did they recover the weapon supposedly used. Richard was released. In June of 1920, he was awarded more money for a new leg. The paper said that he was 14, but he was 20. They also said that he was a rambunctious young man who outgrew his original prosthetic. In 1919, he was sentenced for a few months at a work farm for selling stolen bikes. On September 20th, 1920, Richard was standing on Hudson Avenue when, according to him, a man named Frank Bonanza approached him and immediately tried to shake him down. Frank was a well-known criminal in Brooklyn, and it was rumored that he was the one responsible for Richard getting pinched in 1919. So the two had a history. On this day, though, Richard was not having it. He refused Bonanza. Bonanza pulled a gun and fired at Richard, who took off running. Bonanza followed him, firing. Knowing that he couldn't get away, Richard stopped, and the two either fought over Frank's gun or Richard pulled his own gun, and then shots rang out. Richard put one slug into Bonanza's chest and ran off. Bonanza was taken to the hospital where he said he was shot by a passing car before expiring. 2 Italian men were arrested as the shooters who shot Bonanza from the car. But eventually, the police would arrest Richard, and he would confess and claim self-defense. He even produced his new prosthetic with a fresh bullet hole. The charges were dropped. Anna Lonergan loved Bill, but life goes on. So a few months after Bill was buried in Cypress Hill Cemetery, she married one of his lieutenants, Matty Martin. Now, to say Anna had bad taste in men would be an understatement. She kept getting involved with men who other men wanted dead. On August 19, 1924, Anna and her new husband were walking home from a party and they stopped to get ice cream. As they walked off, 3 men approached and shots rang out. Anna fell to the ground with a bullet in her arm. Martin was also hit twice, in the arm and the chest. The assailants ran away. Martin helped Anna to her feet and gave chase. He and Anna caught up to them, and the couple fought it out with the 3 hoods until the police arrived. They will both be taken to the hospital where they were treated and released. On November 29, 1924, Anna was arrested and held on $1,000 bail after the police were called to her mother's apartment and found the 2 hurling dishes and curse words at each other. On December 18th, she was arrested again for possession of a gun. She told the police that she carried it for protection because her mother had threatened to shoot her during the argument back in November. She was taken to the Raymond Street station, but a grand jury refused to indict her. In September of 24, the Lonergans would face tragedy again when Richard's 6-year-old daughter, Mary Lonergan, came down with an illness and had to be hospitalized. 3 days later, she would pass away. Richard took this hard and began to drink even harder. On Thanksgiving, 1924, the police received reports that a gang was robbing people and 1 man had been shot. At 4 a.m., the police pulled over a taxi at Myrtle Avenue and Fulton Street and arrested 3 men and a woman, or so they thought. When they got back to the station, it was discovered that the woman was actually Frank Burns. He was dressed up like a flapper, wearing a velvet dress, a large coat, gray hat, patent leather pumps, and silk stockings. And in his beaded handbag, the cops found a blue steel revolver. Frank and his men would be found guilty, and Frank was sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing. On August 6, 1925, Peg Leg Lonergan was drunk on the corner of Marcy and Myrtle Avenue, challenging everyone and anyone to a fight. Off-duty detective Edward O'Donnell was on a trolley passing by. He saw the commotion, got off, and walked up. He saw Peg Leg challenging everyone, and he accepted the challenge, and the 2 men began to fight. They fought the whole block from Marcy to Tompkins Avenue, where other cops rushed in. They subdued Richard and arrested him for disorderly conduct. By this time, the gang was rolling in the dough. They controlled the docks, the loaders, the drivers, the handlers, and they were making money selling booze. On Christmas Eve, Richard, along with Cornelius Needles Ferry, James Hart, Aaron Himes, Joe Howard, and Patrick Happy Maloney, were celebrating the holidays by bar hopping, and they were already drunk when they walked into the Adonis Social Club, an Italian-owned speakeasy in an Italian neighborhood. Richard and his boys walked into the place acting belligerently, and they made their way to the back room that had 8 tables surrounding a dance floor, an old piano, and a bar. Richard and his friends were throwing around racial slurs and harassing the staff. Richard and Needles took seats at the table right next to the piano. Hart and the rest were in the middle of the floor where the drinks were served, and Joe Browning was at the piano banging away at a ragtime tune. At the table across from Richard and Needles were a group of Italians who did not appreciate the vile words coming out the Irishman's mouth. One of them got up and went over to where Hymes was standing and said something in Italian, and then a loud thud was heard. Jaime's was hit in the face with a bottle or a butt of a gun, and then the lights went out. And then shots rang out. In the dark, the men at the table fired at Richard and Needles. Hans was shot in the chest after being hit with the bottle. He was dragged outside by his friends, but realizing that he was a goner, they left him in the gutter outside the Adonis. A policeman named Richard Morano was walking his beat and came across Himes lying in the gutter. At first he thought he was a man sleeping, but upon further inspection, he saw that he was dead. He followed the trail of blood that led him to the back of the club where he found peg leg and Needles slumped under the piano. Richard was shot twice, one right above his right eye, and his hand was on the butt of a gun in its holster that he never got to pull. Needles did get his gun out, but he was found laying on top of it, dead from 2 bullets. The rest of the gang escaped. James Hart limped to the hospital with a bullet in his leg at 5 a.m. He said that he was walking down the street when a car rolled by and somebody shot him. He was arrested. So was Maloney and Howard. They told their story, and the police arrested Ralph D'Amato, George Carrozza, Sylvester Agoglia, and Alphonse Capone of 377 18th Street. Like I mentioned, Al and the Irish had a long-running feud. So did his friends. Agoglia was said to have been the one who stabbed the Irishman along with Capone in 1918 before Al took off to Chicago. They would eventually be released after no one would testify. Richard Pegleg Lonergan received a gangster's funeral. Thousands lined up in front of 738 Myrtle Avenue to see the latest white hand leader off the Cypress Hill Cemetery. The police were there too, in plain clothes, and saw Richard's new brother-in-law, Matty Martin, walking heavily. They approached him and Matty went for his piece, but he was apprehended before he could do anything. He was arrested along with Frank Gervasio on gun charges. After Richard's death, the White Hand gang splintered into factions. In the midst of their disunity, the Italian gangs began to have more influence on the docks and bootlegging. That doesn't mean that the gang went away entirely. Anna's new husband was a big man in the gang, now run by Charles Red Donnelly, sometimes known as Cute Charlie. In January 1925, Matty was arrested for shooting up a cafe. No one was hurt, and Anna provided the $3,000 for his release. In January 1928, a man said to be one of the White Hand gang's leaders, Joseph O'Donnell, was shot as he stood on bond and warrant by a woman named Helen Finnegan. He would survive. Miss Finnegan was arrested and charged with the shooting. She said that she shot him as payback for him killing her brother a few months before. On May 17, 1928, Matty Martin was arrested again, this time for the murder of Eddie McGuire. McGuire was a newer member of the gang until he was found with a bullet in him in front of Pier 3. Eddie had challenged Red O'Donnelly for control of the gang's leadership. They agreed on one roll of the dice. Whoever won was the winner. Eddie McGuire shook the dice and rolled a 7, and he announced that he was the new boss. Red Donnelly paused for a moment, reached into his waistband, pulled a revolver, and shots rang out. Red put a slug into Eddie and left him there on Pier 3. Red Donnelly was older than most of the men in the gang. In 1930, he was 42. 2 years after Eddie McGuire was killed, Red was on the dock when a young worker came into the shack and told him that 2 men were outside and wanted to see him. Red said, "Yeah, they probably want to take me for a ride." He went outside and the 3 men walked down the pier. A few moments later, 2 men returned. Red was found dead on Pier 3. He had been drilled twice with a .38 in the chest. The police suspected a silencer was used. Matty Martin was named the new boss, and Matty ran things for a while until the inevitable happened. On December 15, 1931, Matty was lured to a meeting with Richard Tanner at Tanner's Speakeasy at 62 DeKalb Street. When Matty arrived, he was with James Clifford. The men went into a back room and sat down. During the sit-down, Tanner accused Matty of shorting him on the deal. Tanner called Matty a double-crosser, and he gave a signal to his man. The man stepped forward, and shots rang out. The first shot went wild. Matty got up and began to wrestle with Tanner. The shooter then fired several more shots and hit both of the men. The 2 men stumbled out into the street and went their separate ways. Matty made it all the way to his home, where the police found him on the front steps bleeding. He was taken to Cumberland Street Hospital, and Tanner was taken to Brooklyn Hospital. Anna Lonergan Lovett Martin vowed revenge. She told the papers that if Matty didn't tell who shot him, she would tell the gang who did it, and they would wipe them all out, even if she had to do it herself. A few days later, George Rosanda was at a cafe at 136 Fort Greene Place. 5 men and a woman were also in the place when 3 men kicked the door in, and one of them walked up to Rosanda. And shots rang out. Rosanda was shot twice in the head at point-blank range. The shooter then aimed his gun at a witness and told him to scram. Then one of the other men said, "No, wait." They took him as a hostage as they loaded the body of Rosanda into a car and dumped it in Queens. The man was taken to Manhattan and told not to say nothing, but he said something. But no one was arrested. Later that day, Matty Martin died from his injuries, 10 hours after his killer. With that, the White Hand Gang was no more. All the original members who took over the docks in 1919 were dead or in jail. From 1931 on, the docks will be run by Italian mafioso like Vince Mangano, Albert Anastasia, Tough Tony Anastasio, and Joe Adonis. So, that's the skinny on the White Hand Gang. I hope you guys enjoy the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. Honestly, this was one of the funniest stories I've ever researched. There was so much stuff that I had to leave things out or I would never get the video out. But the lives that these guys lived was crazy, and I'm glad I did the video again. So you guys know, if you haven't already, bump off that subscribe button, ring the bell, set it for all notifications, break that thumb. Patreon and YouTube members have a different video for this with all the gory stuff that I can't show you on YouTube. So if you're into stuff like that, go get yourself a membership and you can see all of that. If you want to slide an envelope upstairs to the boss to help the channel run smooth, the PayPal link is in the description. The merch store is open. Go get yourself something nice. All right, so I know I'm late, but Happy New Year's to all you guys. Let's make this one a good one. All right, so this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I see you in the funnies. On a personal note, I would like to say happy birthday to my grandfather, Sherwood P. Harris. He would have been 115 years old this week, and I just found out he shared a birthday with Peg Leg Lonergan. He grew up in Harlem, and he had a grandmother who came over from Ireland in the 1860s. And every time I left, he would say, don't take any wooden nickels. So all my videos are dedicated to him. And I just wanted to say that. Happy birthday, Granddad. I love you.